So do turn back to Psalm 93, and we're looking at this psalm together this evening. Where do you find an unchanging standard? Having an unchanging standard is important in lots of things, isn't it? In measurements, you want to have a weight that doesn't change, or a distance that doesn't change, or you get very mixed up. It's very important. Financially, you have some kind of unchanging standard, and when the pound plummets, then it impacts everyone around. But what about a standard for life? What about having a standard for life? This psalm is telling us that there is an absolute ruler who has the right and who does set absolute rules. He has the right to set standards, and he is the majestic king of the universe. We're going to be looking at this short psalm this evening. The two main headings. First of all, looking at God's majestic reign and how that's shown to us in some way by some of the things that he's made. That's what the writer of this psalm wants us to get from it, to start to picture something of just how majestic God is, to start to picture something of just how powerful and how permanent God is, and how permanent his reign over the universe is, and how important that is for us as part of the creation that he's made. But also to look at the implications of that and the way that the psalm writer has structured this psalm. He's leading up to a view of what does that mean for you and for me as we live our lives in a world which is full of change, in a world where perhaps the only thing you can be sure of is that it's going to keep on changing, and that people will keep fluctuating and changing their minds and changing their priorities and changing what's important to them, changing what they say is right and what they say is wrong. In a world like that, why is it so important to know the king who doesn't change? First of all, God's majestic reign is the topic of this psalm, and God's majestic reign and his strength. Just read verse 1 again. The Lord reigns. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. The picture is of God putting on his garments that show something of his majesty and his splendor. You probably watched the coronation earlier in the year, and you see the king coming in with all the regalia and stuff, and he takes some stuff off and he puts other things on, and everything that he's putting on is there to give some kind of glimpse of his position, his majesty, his power as the king. It's not there just to show that he's got a good wardrobe, or to show that he's got a good set of clothes, or what a lot of nice crowns he's got. It's there to show something of his majesty and something of his authority. Now, how do we see God's majesty and authority? Well, we see it as that version of the psalm we sang puts it. We see it in the things that he's made. The things that God has made give us a taste of some of the invisible attributes of God. Some of the things which we cannot see God, can we? We can't see him. We can't see what he's like for ourselves. But the things that we need to know about him have been revealed to us through his word, but also he illustrates them for us in the world around us. And for the purpose of this song that this writer here is writing, there's two big things about God that he wants to explain to us. And he picks out two big aspects of creation to show them to us. And the two things he wants to get across are God's permanence and the permanence of his reign, and also his power and the power of his reign. First of all, he says, think about how permanent God is. And start by looking at, he says, look at the world. What's your illustration for God's permanence? It's the planet Earth that we live on. You open your door and you go out every day, and the world is still there, isn't it? It's still there, pretty much unchanged from last time. And of course, if you're out in space looking at our planet, it keeps on doing the same thing. It goes around the sun. It does it every 365 and a bit days. It keeps revolving on its axis. It does it every 24 hours. And nothing swerves it from its course. If some asteroid were to hit the Earth and blot out all life, it would carry on doing that thing that it does today. It would keep going around the sun, and it would keep revolving on its axis, and it would keep doing what it's done from the beginning of creation. The world is established. It shall never be moved, says the writer of this song. Look at the world. Look how fixed and how unchanging this planet and its behaviour is. Nothing stops it. Nothing swerves it from its course. Nothing shakes it from the beginning of creation to today down to the end. The world is solid and dependable. But God and his reign stretch back even further. Verse 2, your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. God and his throne, his reign over everything, stretches back into everlastingness, back beyond the beginning of everything, back beyond the day when this world first started to rotate on its axis. God was there, and he was ruling. You, the writer says, are from everlasting. God has no beginning, and he has no end. Don't know if anyone's ever said to you, sometimes people pull this out when you're talking to them about God. They say, well, where did God come from? If God is the one who made everything, who made God? And some writers and other people have popularized that argument that you say, where did God come from? Or who made him? If you can't answer that question, can you? And that just makes the whole idea of God seem silly, doesn't it? But the answer is here in the Bible, isn't it? It always has been here. God has always been from everlasting. God has no beginning. He has no start. And that's not just some clever answer that Christians have come up with to flummox Richard Dawkins. That's how God defines himself. If you start talking about a God who has a beginning, that's not the God of the Bible, because God has always told us that he had no beginning. God is from everlasting. Nothing started God, because he never started. Right back from the beginning of time and before the beginning of time, God was there, and his throne was established. God and his reign is so much more permanent than the earth. The earth had a beginning a few thousand years ago when God created it out of nothing. It started spinning on its axis. It started its journey around the sun. It's kept that up unchanged ever since. But one day, that will come to an end. The world will stop spinning on its axis and going around the sun on the day when Jesus returns and rolls up the universe and throws it away. But God's throne will never come to an end, and it will never change. The first thing to get about God's majestic reign is it's permanent. It's not some new thing that we've come up with. It's not something which God started at some point in the past, but he has always reigned, and he always will. And the second thing that the psalm writer wants to get across to us about God's reign is his power. His power. And here the illustration changes, and we focus in on something smaller, but something which is very powerful. He says, look at a flooded, mighty river. The floods, he says, have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Have you ever been to a huge waterfall and you see the water plunging over this cliff or over this weir or whatever it is and crashing into the river below? And the noise is deafening, isn't it? You can hardly hear yourself think as you stand by a plunging waterfall and you hear the sound of it echoing all around you. There's power, right, isn't there? There's tons of water pour down a channel. For the people of Israel, as they're writing this, they know what flooded rivers are like. The Jordan floods its banks and it sweeps things down before it. But the Jordan's only a small river. And when the Israelites thought about rivers in flood, they typically thought of the Euphrates and perhaps the Nile, the big rivers, particularly the Euphrates over to the east from which they'd originally come. Abraham had come from beyond the Euphrates to come to the land of Israel. And the river Euphrates, most of the volume of its water floods down there in a couple of months every spring as all the snow melts in the mountains of Turkey and that whole area, and the water floods down what is the largest river in the Middle East. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. When the people of Israel thought about these great flooded rivers and the floodplains of the Euphrates, they also thought about the great and powerful nations that lived around it. In Isaiah chapter 7 and 8, God likens the coming invasion of, at that time, the Assyrian Empire to the flooded river, which was going to overflow its banks and not simply stay in the floodplains of the Euphrates, but God says, sweep down through Israel. Sweep down through Israel into Judah and across Emmanuel's land. A flooded river is an immensely powerful and loud thing. And the nations around Israel were also very loud and powerful and mighty. Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 8 is talking about the Assyrian Empire, which floods over the land of Israel, and that will be followed, as Brian was saying this morning, by the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire, as each one of those overflowed their banks and flooded the land of Israel. But there's something much mightier than a flooded river, God tells his people. Look at the flooded rivers. Look at a river in flood plunging over a waterfall. Even better, listen to that. Listen to the volume rising as the river comes down in spate. God's voice is louder and mightier, and nothing reaches as high as him. However high those flood waters rise, they don't come close to God. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. As the floods lift up, God is the one who is on high. As the floods lift up their voice, God's voice is mightier than their thunders. So God's majestic reign, the psalm writer tells us in these two great illustrations, is both permanent and it is powerful. Its permanence and its power mark it out as completely unique. Remember, as you look around the world today, just as this man's looking around the world 2,000-3,000 years ago, remember that nothing approaches the permanence and the power of God and of his reign. When you see powerful nations, or you see powerful commercial empires, or you see powerful individuals and influences, nothing is going to be permanent the way that God is permanent. Nothing is going to be powerful the way that God is powerful. It should greatly encourage us as we seek to base our lives on God's word. We'll come to God's word in a second. So we seek to base our lives on God's word to know that he is unchanging, that he is powerful, and that he is reigning today as much as he was back in the time of ancient Israel. And this brings us up to the implication with a couple of implications really following from one conclusion, which the psalm writer wants to get us to, which is really verse 5. Having seen these two great pictures of his reign, his permanence and his power, he brings us to God's decrees, God's word. God's unchanging decrees. And God's decrees are there for two things. He says they're there to trust and they're there to obey. First of all, God's unchanging decrees are to trust. He says, your decrees, the things that you've said, are very trustworthy. Now, God isn't simply a powerful force who exists, is he? He's not like the force in Star Wars, right, which is out there and it sort of controls your destiny. God speaks. He is a person, and he says things. He's a king, and he issues decrees. God's rule is seen in what he says. A good king is a king who issues decrees which are good, isn't he? You could have a decree who shows all his might by fighting against his enemies and his friends and everyone else, and just has this great display of military power. But a good king is going to issue decrees. He's going to make rules, and those rules are going to be just and true and good. This is the sort of king that God is. He doesn't simply exist or make a powerful show. He issues decrees. And he issues decrees which are not going to be changed. If you remember in the book of the story of Daniel, the laws of the Medes and Persians, so one of the empires that overran Israel at one point, their laws couldn't be changed, could they? As Daniel found out to his cost, the king wasn't able to change the law even when he wanted to set Daniel free. And he had, by law, to throw Daniel into the den of lions because he'd made a foolish law, and he had to stick by it. But the laws of the Medes and Persians didn't last, did they? They came, and a few years later they went, and the Greeks took over instead. And all the laws and the legal system of the Medes and Persians came crumbling down. They didn't last very long. They didn't really have very wide scope. They had a biggish empire for the time, but they ruled over a portion of the Middle East. They were a small and short-lived kingdom. God's decrees are very trustworthy because they are completely wide in scope. There's nothing outside the scope of God's decrees because he rules over the universe with all power. And there's no point at which God's decrees will cease to be relevant because he and his rule is permanent. And so his decrees are very trustworthy. His decrees can be trusted to all time, and his decrees can be trusted in all place, because that's the extent of God's rule. Now, it's really important to know this about God's decrees, isn't it? That God's decrees are very trustworthy. And that's partly because in God's decrees, God has made promises. He hasn't simply issued decrees telling people what to do, but he's issued decrees which explain what he will do in his kingdom. The writer of this psalm knows that God has made promises, that God has made promises at a huge worldwide scale, that God has said that the time will come when the earth will be filled with the glory of God, as the waters cover the sea. And he knows that is what God has promised. He knows that God has promised that all the nations will be blessed through the offspring of Abraham. And so even though he's a Jew in ancient Israel, living in this tiny nation on the border of the Mediterranean, with all these much larger nations around and about who are constantly fighting over them, and sometimes things seem so uncertain and so unsure as to who will be in power at any time, he knows that God's decrees and God's promises can be trusted. The time will come when the whole earth will be filled with the glory of God, when all nations will be blessed through the offspring of Abraham. Now, as we look back, we can see how God has been doing that, can't we? We can see how God has been blessing the nations through Christ as the offspring of Abraham. We can see how all around the world today there are people who glorify the true God. We can see how God is continuing to increase, and Jesus is continuing to build his kingdom just as he has promised. It's amazing that this writer so long ago was so confident, isn't it, in God's decrees. But at the same time, it's not amazing, is it? You know, if God truly is the king, if we truly believe that God is the king, who rules over everything, who has all power, and who is completely permanent and nothing can unseat him, then we should, by default, be completely trusting his decrees. It shouldn't be something that we have to go, well, maybe I'll trust it if God does this, or maybe I'll trust God if he says that, or if this happens. We should simply trust God, knowing who he is, knowing his power and his permanence. Be confident in God's promises. You know, don't go around thinking, well, maybe God will keep his promises. God will. He will do what he has decreed. But the second thing about God's unchanging decrees is not only that they're there to trust, but they're there to obey. The conclusion that the writer draws from it is this. He says, "Your decrees are very trustworthy. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore." God is the king who has given commands. He's the king who's made rules and set standards. His decrees set the standards for his kingdom, as well as his promises of what he will do in his kingdom. And with a ruler like this, who is permanent and powerful, it's obviously fitting that his servants in his house, that they live in accordance with his rules, that they're marked by following the rules of the king. Holiness befits his house. And also, crucially here, his rules never change. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. In a world where human standards are constantly changing and people are always, there's always new things coming on, aren't there, which you have to be doing this to be one of the good people. And one set after another of changing values and changing things that you have to do to be seen to be moral in society. When you have all these things going on, it's really important that we know that God's laws and God's word is unchanging and it can be trusted. One of the things in the a large portion of the Church of England at the moment is that they're trying to adjust their position, certainly on sexual morality. And they're going away from what God's word has said because they think that what other people say around them might be a good thing to add in. It's like, yes, we'll bless these types of relationships. Yes, we'll allow this type of thing to happen in the church because, after all, everyone around us says it's all right. Really, basically, that's what it comes down to. And we've moved on a bit from what God says in the Bible, though they might not say that out loud. Holiness befits God's house forevermore. There's no point at which what the world around us says starts to take precedence over what God says. And in a culture where our culture is more and more saying the opposite of what God says, it's very important that we're firm on that, isn't it? We've had a bit of an easy ride for a long time, where we've had a bit of a Christian culture around us, which has similar-ish standards to what God has set out in the Bible. But as the standards of the world change and move away from God's standards, it's very important that we know where our standards come from and that we're confident in them. John Bunyan has his character Faithful say in the book The Pilgrim's Progress. He says he's thinking about how he should respond to the pressures around him in the world, and he says he realized this: what God says is right, indeed is right, though all the men in the world were against it. So let's read that quote from Bunyan again. What God says is right, indeed is right, though all the men in the world were against it. In this world where human standards are fluctuating, what God says is right still is right. And that shouldn't surprise us, should it? God's rule is permanent, and God's rule is powerful. What we should be doing is going back to the decrees of the permanent, powerful King, which will never change, and his voice, which is mightier than the flooded rivers around us, and again, be confident in what he has said. When everyone around you is doing this or doing that, what should we be doing? We should be being confident that God's decrees can be trusted, and then we should be aligning our lives with his holiness. God's decrees are not simply something out there to write your name under or to sign up to, but they're something to be lived out in holiness, which means a separation, a distinctness from the people around you. If you are the servants of this King, working in his house, serving before his throne, then holiness is what is fitting. Be confident that his decrees can be trusted and align your life with his holiness. Now, if you're not a Christian, or if this is something that you're not sure that you're doing, well, this is a really important thing for you to know, isn't it? That there is a God who is permanent and who is powerful, and that there is an unchanging standard. There is a foundation for life which is established more certainly than the foundation of the earth, the writer here is saying. There is an established foundation, God's rule, in the context of which you can build and live out your life in trust in him and in holiness before him. That's the hope that we have as Christians, as God is working in us to make us more holy, to make us more fit to serve before him, and as we are confident in our trust, which is placed not on just some ideas of people who wrote them down a long time ago, but on the unchanging and the powerful reign of God.